Hello everyone, welcome to Zobrio University's webinar on MIP year-end preparation. Today we have Kathy Dwyer, a Senior Application Consultant here at Zobrio, to lead the webinar. If you have any questions, please leave them in the chat, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and we will go over all questions at the end. Thank you. I will now hand it back over to Kathy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Colleen. As Colleen mentioned, this is Kathy. I work out of what we refer to as our Boston office, but we're basically a town south of Boston, heading towards Cape Cod. What we want to talk about today is some work that you can do ahead of time as we think about year-end processes like W-2s and 1099s, and not so much ACA today because time restrictions, and as far as it gets into the HR module of MIP, but we're certainly happy to talk to you about that in more detail. But let me jump right in where there's a lot of information to cover in a short period of time. I think first and foremost is when we talk about year-end, there's always a software release that includes any programming changes to produce the various forms, 1099s, W-2s. The version that we'll be looking for is 2020.1.1. And the way you can tell what current version you're on in MIP is up under the help. When you're at the kind of the main entry screen, there's a help button, and if you go on down to About MIP, it will tell you what version you're on. This particular laptop that I'm demonstrating on was fortunate enough to have a pre-release of the software, so we could take a look at the changes. But if you're not on version 2020.1, we make a note that we got to get that software updated. And what that will do is not only will it update your software to produce the forms for our payroll users, the federal tax tables will be updated. And likewise, the changes for payroll, when we talk about W-4s, the way federal taxes will be calculated, there's changes in there that will impact payroll if you're just a payroll user. Or if you have the HR module, the changes are in there, as well as employee web services where the employee can see how they set up their W-4 information. Okay. Now, the big thing to know about that is if you're somebody that wants to update the software on your own or check in with us, we need to have local administrative rights when we're setting up or installing that software. Oftentimes, getting a hold of that administrator password can be problematic, but if your IT team is involved and they prefer to log us in, we can do something like that as well. Okay. Also, do keep in mind if you're updating, if you have a release of the software prior to version 19.3, the release is accumulative in the sense that if you're on 19.1, when we apply the latest software, version 19.2 will get installed, 19.3, 20.1, 20.11. And just to let you know, release 19.3 impacted the workstations, meaning if you have users that access your MIP software through not necessarily remote desktop to the server, but if they have the client, meaning they have a local desktop icon and they're accessing my MIP through the client, there is also a client update that involves some, not technicality, but some software called .NET that needs to be installed. And it's self-installable. My biggest point here is it takes a little bit of time to get that done, so this software update may take a little bit longer than what you're used to. Okay. The modules that will be affected will be your MIP fund accounting, if you're a HR user, if you're an employee web service user, and if you use DrillPoint, the Excel add-in. Those are the modules that will be impacted by this update. Okay. Next subject I wanted to talk to you a little bit about is, of course, the forms. When you talk about the need to print W-2s or print 1099s, certainly we use through the software is Atrix, which is basically the engine that drives the creation of the W-2s and 1099s. There's an option in there that through Atrix, you can create the data and upload it to the folks at Atrix, and they can either print your forms in e-file and basically do all the work at a cost per person or per recipient, per employee, or there's combinations where you could print your local forms, like maybe your employee copies or your recipient copies of your 1099s. You can print them locally and have the e-file occur through Atrix. So you can either have a full-blown Atrix do basically all the printing and e-filing, or you can have the Atrix just do the e-filing. And the cost is, let me just slip through here. I believe it's like $1.74 maybe if you do the full, and it's like 69 cents if you do the option just to have them e-file. And that's per count, per employee count, per recipient count. Okay. The forms themselves, there is a website called, www.abillachecks.com, and that's all one word, abillachecks.com. And in there, I'm not saying you have to order your forms through there because they're basically blank 4-up, meaning 4 quadrants to an 11-inch sheet that is used for your employer and employee copies, or your recipient copies. The thing is, you can always go to that website, and it's an area for tax forms. You can take a look just so that you feel comfortable that you're ordering the correct forms and envelopes. So you can either order it through the abillachecks.com or just get an idea of what the forms are that you need. Okay. Now, from here, where we go is let's actually look at some of the software and show you a couple of things that you can do ahead of time. Is here under organization, there is this organization information selection. And the different things that you want to just double check prior to really getting into the swing of creating your forms or loading that Atrix grid is here on the first tab for organization, you want to make sure the name is correct. You want to make sure that your federal tax ID is here and it's correct. If you're filing 1099s and you have a state withholding, you want to make sure you got your state and your tax ID in here. Okay. And what ends up happening is if this information is missing as you're going through the process of your 1099s and your W-2s, you'll get into the Atrix grid, which think very much like an Excel spreadsheet grid. If you see the wrong values, you have to cancel out and come back here and get it updated. So start by just double checking your organization. Of course, looking at the address tab is always a good idea. Make sure things look fine here. And lastly here under organization, what we want to look at is the electronic filing tab. Okay. Now, what this will do is it's just some generic information that gets fed into the e-file that gets uploaded to Atrix. And what it basically really says here is if there's a problem, who do we notify and how? So as you can see, the options here are either through the mail service or email itself, who, email addresses, and then the personal identification number if you've been assigned one by the IRS or Social Security Administration. Okay. A few other fields here for unique situations. Did your business terminate? Unlikely, sick party, third-party sick pay, and things of that nature. So really here, for the most part, if you've been on MIP for a couple of years, this information is probably pretty solid, but it's a good idea to take a look at it. Okay. Kind of the next household item that you might want to take a look at is a security. Okay, and basically what happens is you want to make sure is if you're new to creating your W-2s or 1099s, or for that matter, your 1095s for the ACA reporting, you want to make sure that you have the right security assigned to your username. And just briefly, the way that happens here is up under the button for security. What it is you come down to where it says set up organization menus. And you may or may not have the rights to do this depending on your current security setting, but if you're charged with creating the forms and you're missing some security setups, this is where a privileged or an admin user would come in. And here under your organization menus, basically this is where you can set up either by user or by groups of users security rights. And why don't I just grab Annabelle? And by the way, I'm working in the NTO organization database, which is the database that comes in, gets preloaded when the software is installed on your machine. Okay. Now, what happens here with the security is basically this, is under accounting and then activities. If we start with the payroll coming down, I'll just hitting the plus signs to expand it. You'll notice down here under payroll is tax forms and e-filing. Okay, you need to be a user, and now kind of focus in the upper right-hand side that has view and edit rights. Okay, and as long as you have those two rights assigned to that particular job, you'll be able to produce W-2s and your 1095s. Okay. From an AP perspective, we're in the same area. However, we're going to go to accounts payable, and it's this produce vendor 1099s. It's very similar in the sense in the upper right, we need to have view, edit, and in this case, process records. And as long as those permissions are granted, you'll be able to produce the forms. Okay. So those are just, again, some just generic household items. The biggest of those being, of course, we got to make sure we get the software updated. Okay. Now, from here, what you want to do basically is be able to proof your data. You know, for instance, let's say we're talking about W-2s. And what can you do ahead of time? Well, there's any number of reports in the system that you can run to validate data or just proof your data. And some of this information, like for instance, let's say you bring somebody into the grid, the Atrix grid, and you notice the address is wrong and you want to change it. Well, you can change something like that in the Atrix grid, but it's always better to come back in and change it in the master file ahead of time. And the reason for that is if you happen to be reloading the Atrix grid, maybe you get started, you have some hard errors that need to be corrected, and you want to do a do-over. If you corrected it in the grid and then you do a do-over, you got to correct it again. Whereas if you do the changes in the master files, for instance, here with the payroll, if we were to come in here to the employee information file, and I'll just grab the first employee here in the list. Any changes that you make here, whether it be to the address tab, or if you come down to the W-2 tab, which is an important place to be, you just want to make your changes here. So in terms of well, does that mean I have to go edit every person and look at them? You know, no, you don't need to do that. You could more or less rely on your reports, start from that perspective. And let me give you an idea what I mean by that is if we go to reports and we come on down to payroll and we go to lists, okay, there's all kinds of different reports that are out here. This one, if I happen to go to employee information with the idea that I'm going to look at some demographic information, there are, of course, as we know, a bunch of standard reports that are identified with the pointy brackets on the left and the right of the report name. You can basically establish a report, and I have one called employee information that basically brings up all that information on a single report that, again, can be exported to Excel or a PDF, but rather than editing each person to know if it's good or bad or any changes are required, keep in mind you can always do this through a report. And with our reports, we can control page breaks in the upper right. The lower right is the contents that appear on that report. So based on the data items, I like to call them, or the fields, you can, perhaps you want to move the marital status and add it to the report. It's just a matter of selecting it, moving it to the right. Okay. So that's a biggie with the payroll is maybe reviewing your demographic data. Okay. There is also, you can review your federal tax information by going to reports and maybe down to the payroll, to your history, and then there's a category called taxes. Okay. Again, in here, you have a series of reports, and you can really select any one of these reports, and you might find that you select it. Like I have one here I call history. The big thing there is when you're running any of your validation reports, whether it be from your W-2s or your 1099s, if you have a setup tab that presents a date range, make sure that you indeed have, in this case I have 2018 because that's as far as the database goes, but make sure you've got your January through your December of calendar 2019. Again, keep in mind that you can control page breaks, column contents. There's also filter options in some case. Okay, and you'll notice here on this particular report, I wasn't really interested in state tax or SUDR, and then those LWTs and LERs. Those are more local taxes. Okay, but it's more or less reports like this that they can be run any different number of ways. But what they'll present for you in this case is we can see on this report. I don't have a lot of employees in this database, but we can see a group of employees that had federal withholding, who they are, their gross earnings, their earnings subject to federal tax, and the actual deduction. So it's a quick way of really pulling a report that validates your data. Okay. And again, there's a series of these reports that are out there. No one report is necessarily better than the other. They all do something different depending on what you're looking for. The one thing that I will say from a W-2 perspective is it's always a real good idea to make sure that the information that you're going to pull into the Atrix grid agrees with the 941s that you filed. And you can run a report, and let me pull this up for you here. It goes under reports, I'm going to come down to payroll. I'm going to come to the tax worksheets and this 941 worksheet. You can either run this here, and I'll grab a report that I have here. You can either, again, run this report for the entire year, or if you want to validate back against each quarter, you just control it by the date range. And what's going to happen here is you're going to get a 941, and definitely want to validate this before you proceed with your W-2s, because that's a huge flag when you file a W-2 that includes your W-3, and if it doesn't match your 941s, Social Security Administration is going to get a flag and come talk with you. Nobody wants that. Okay. These jobs, too, that I'm referring to can be run any number of times. You know, if you want to get started on it now, even though you might have another payroll, maybe 2 more payrolls in the calendar year, you certainly can do that just to get started in on this. Do keep in mind, if you want to actually see the W-2 box information, that really is here under reports, payroll, and payroll tax worksheets. When you get there, at that particular level, getting the report is really a 2-stepper. One, you calculate the W-2 information, and the trick is you select the calendar year that you want to calculate for, and then what ends up happening is your employees will populate in this grid. You can select them all and tell it to calculate. that just goes out and pulls all the information into a database file so that the second step in the process would be back under reports, tax, and then the W-2 information is really down here. And again, when you run that, it will show you employee by employee, where the 941 is the overall total. You can look at it overall and see the different boxes that are being populated, that will populate into the grid, and it just preliminary work. And always keep in mind too, as I heard yesterday, a pretty good reference that sometimes when you're editing a report way out to the right-hand side, you have column titles. Oftentimes, if you create this W-2 report, it's not a bad idea. Instead of saying box 1, you might want to just pull out a W-2 and actually indicate, like, okay, this is our gross wages, or here's our federal tax box, here's our state tax box. Just a little bit more information other than box 1, box 2. Okay. Now, staying with payroll for just one more second here, if you happen to run a report and you look and you see that there's a problem and that you need to make some corrections, and perhaps you don't have any additional payroll, there's a problem with somebody, they've since left your employee, but you need to adjust their history, keep in mind you can always go up under activities and down to payroll. And under payroll, there's this set up and adjust employee balances. Okay? This literally allows you to select an individual employee, and the system does require an adjustment number. And it's just, to be honest with you, it's just a number to represent an entry, because once you put in an adjustment and post it, you can't go back and edit it, but you can always add a second adjustment to maybe reverse something that might have been posted. But this biggest thing here is you get the right employee, make sure your effective date falls within your calendar year, and you'll see up at the top here, there's different tabs where you can adjust your earnings, your benefits, your deductions, workers' comp, taxes, leave, and it all feeds into the history file, and that will all be part of your W-2 reporting. Okay. Now, let me, for those folks that are on the line that are interested a little bit on the 1099s, let me tell you a little bit about those. Is basically what happens here is under maintain, under vendors, okay? And let's just go ahead and pick a vendor. When you see your vendor, you want to be sure that the name and the address, and as we know with MIP, you can have multiple addresses per vendor. However, it's the main address of a vendor that populates into your grid, into your, and again, when I say the grid, I mean Atrix, and it's from the Atrix grid that the forms and the e-file get created. Okay, but you basically have names and addresses, and down here on your 1099 information tab, couple of things happen here. Is if this box in the upper left is not checked off, then everything else is low-lighted or you don't have access to it. It's only when you indicate that somebody's a 1099 vendor that these other fields become pertinent. The proprietor name is a necessary field if somebody is identified through their Social Security number as opposed to their federal ID. Okay. Skipping through a few things, you'd identify the type of form. Like in this case, I have somebody set up as a 1099 miscellaneous. As we know, on the miscellaneous form, there's different boxes. I think most common is box 7, the non-employee compensation. You have a name control, which in general is, and this is required by the IRS, it's a value that gets put into the electronic file that gets uploaded. It's typically the first 4 characters of a company name or the first 4 characters of the last name of an individual. Okay. And then lastly, what I just wanted to point out too is let's say you've gone through the year, partially through the year, and you've paid a vendor, and then you later realize that vendor, oops, they were subject to 1099. Even if you come in here to the vendor file and you, at that point, code them as 1099, that's only going to impact your purchases going forward. What's in the history file, or what was previously paid and posted, it's by changing your vendor file, it's not going to change those history records. So what do you do in that case? Well, that's this grid that you see at the bottom of the screen. And what it allows you to do is select, like in our case, it would be 2019. You could select the type of form, and the system will do, and I'll show you with the drop down. It does these different types of 1099s. But what you do is you would enter a transaction, which, as you can see in the grid, it can be the plus or minus, which allows you to add something to the 1099 accumulation or reduce it or take it away. And what ends up happening is when you process your 1099s, the system looks at the history file, it looks at this grid for the year you're running the forms for, combines the two together, and that becomes the total for the individual or the recipient. So again, changes aren't retroactive to the history file, but this is a nice little grid that allows you to make adjustments, whether they be plus or minus. Okay. And that, again, we're in the vendor file. Okay. Now, there's also, and I guess I better pick it up a little bit, there is also a series of reports that you can run. Not only will you find under reports and accounts payable, you've got vendor information. You can get a report on just adjustments if you choose to. Okay. You can also, under the reports category, go to your journals, select your cash journal, and in that particular category, again, you'll see that there's different 1099 reports, and always think of the reports within those pointed brackets. They're intended to be templates, and you certainly can copy those out and make changes if you don't particularly like how a particular report sorts, or where it page breaks, or you want to add additional column content. Definitely feel free to do that, and you can really just take one of these reports, make the adjustments, and as you go to save it, it will ask you for a new name. Okay. And the big thing there is, again, you can do that ahead of time to get you started in, or you can wait until you've processed your last check run as of 12/31. Okay. To kind of show us a little bit about the Atrix grid is Atrix is an independent company that integrates with a lot of different accounting software packages, and they're basically authorities on the tax laws, and they're constantly upgrading their software. And what that means basically is we've got to do the same thing. We want to make sure that when we go to start processing the forms, that indeed our Atrix programs are up to date. Okay, and the way you do that is, and this is where you process or get the processing started as well, is up under activities. We'll pick on payroll again, and we'll come all the way down to tax forms and e-filing. And when you get to this screen, things to note is this primarily is, notice way over to the right-hand side, there's a button that says Form Updates. Okay. Mine doesn't have focus right now because I went through and updated my forms earlier. If you do this once, you might have to do it weekly. You might even have to do it daily as we get closer to producing the forms. What's happening is, again, Atrix is responding to any federal changes, and they're releasing the software constantly. But the good news is you just click on that button, you tell it to do automatic updates, it will download the software, and you're ready to go. Okay. Actually a couple of notes about that, whether you're updating the forms for your W-2s or your 1099s. You do need to have local administrative rights on your machine to run that update. Okay, and that's a Windows setting. So again, if you go hit that button and you get some type of error message, it probably means you don't have enough permissions and would have to talk to your IT staff about either giving you the admin username and password, or giving more permissions to your username. Okay. Two, sometimes when you're running the form update, it appears like it's running, but where is it? You're not seeing it. You might end up having to minimize a few screens, and it could be running in the background. Okay, and then third, and these principles apply to both the payroll and the AP. Third, this is on a per workstation basis. So if there's one individual in your organization that's responsible for payroll, they come in and they run the forms update. If you've got another individual that's responsible for running the 1099s, they also need to come in here and run the form updates, because it does respond back to the local workstation level. And just to kind of show you this, it's activities, accounts payable, produce 1099s, grid opens, and again, you've got your form updates. Okay, and once you do that, once you, like in this case, we start off with new. Once we run the form updates, if you need to do that, always close out of the job and then come back in, and what got updated will then be available in this window, because it's like getting out and coming back in is like a refresh. Okay. You basically, when you're in here, you're really answering some questions. More or less the filter that you see on this front screen, it's not used too often unless perhaps you have one group of 1099, maybe miscellaneous, and maybe another group of 1099 interest or something like that. But for the most part, what you're doing is you're tabbing through the fields, answering a series of questions. Once you've finished answering the questions, the grid will load up with the information, and that's where you will see on the left side of the grid demographic data, names and addresses. The right side of the grid, you'll see boxes for, depending on what the form is, box 1, box 2, box 3, and you always want to validate that information back against your reports. Okay, because it is, even though Atrix is embedded in your software, it's not a separate program that you go back out to the command prompt or anything to run. It's embedded in the software, but we always want to validate that data. Okay. And then finally, just to let you know, is the current deadlines that we have in place, or the federal government has put in place, is 1/31 of 20 is when the forms need to be out in your employee or recipient hands. So it's one of those things where, you get to your last payroll, maybe you wait till you get through the holidays, and you can get started on this process. Okay. For our payroll users, you don't have to have your W-2s done before you process your first payroll for January. The big thing there with your first January payroll is always remember that the biggest thing you have to do there is in your payroll setup is you've got your processing groups, and in your processing groups, there's a pay schedule. And what the pay schedule is really, and I'll bring up the 2020, it's really just more or less for the calendar year. You're establishing your check issue dates with your pay period begin and your pay period ending dates, and more or less if you have SUTA, the number of SUTA weeks in that pay period. And that is really all you need to do as far as getting the payroll prepared to do your first January payroll. As long as you have your tax tables or your version 2020.11 is loaded onto your system, the tax tables will be automatically updated. And I'll show you one other thing because it's kind of interesting to know. Here in the payroll setup in the employee file, with the changes to the W-4 for 2020, this is a little bit what it will look like. And this is make change, and excuse me, I'm on the wrong tab. You'll notice here the number of filing status checkboxes or circles here are reduced. You'll see that there's a checkbox here for is your W-4 prior to 2020, or is it January 1st and later? If it is later than January 1st, we no longer have the number of exemptions are no longer important, but rather to the right-hand side of the screen, we're filling out dollar amounts, dependents total, other income total, and there's a section on the IRS website that talks about how to filling that out. So just to let you know that MIP has been progressive. They will have in this release of the software the changes to accommodate the W-4 changes for 2020, and that will be, you'll see that not only here if you're a payroll user on the federal tax tab, it's also, you'll see that in HR and the employee information table and the federal tax tab. Okay. So that's all I got for now. I apologize, I talked a little bit longer than I probably should have, but does anybody have any questions that they'd like to throw out there? Okay. Well, keep in mind, my email address is Kathy with a K, .Dwyer, D-W-Y-E-R, @Zobrio.com. If you have any questions or would like to expand on any subject here, feel free to drop me an email and we'll talk and go from there. But I do appreciate your time. I know everybody's busy, and thank you for attending.
Thank you, everyone. A recording of this webinar will be made available shortly.